Hi, Roger.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You're Roger Peterson, a political scientist at MIT. And I'm very excited about this conversation because I think we're going to look at the Trump phenomenon and the psychology that drives it from an unusual perspective. And by that I mean that you are not a political scientist who specializes in American domestic politics. You have studied ethnic conflict in places around the world, mainly the Balkans, I guess. But I think you and I agree that the psychology that drives ethnic conflict, certainly including violent ethnic conflict, has something to do with what's going on in American politics right now. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, and the main political science organization, APSA, just sent me a book, by the way, by University of Chicago Press called Resentment is about the politics with Scott Walker in Wisconsin. So there are other political science organizations who know my ideas from developed elsewhere and think that they might have something to do with the United States. So I that's thought about it a little bit.
Yeah. And let me mention a couple of your books: Understanding Ethnic Violence, Fear, Hatred, Resentment in 20th Century Eastern Europe, and more recently, Western Intervention in the Balkans, The Strategic Use of Emotion in Conflict, both of those by Cambridge University Press. Now, the way your work came to my attention is there was a recent piece in Vox by Zach, I think Beauchamp is something like the way he pronounces it, that got a lot of attention. That kind of discounted economic explanations of support for Trump and focused on other things, and resentment, which you just mentioned, is one of them. And it was in that connection in particular, in talking about resentment as a driver of support for Trump, that your work was introduced in the piece. Now, do you want to describe, for starters, the work of yours that was invoked at that point and what you concluded?
Yeah, well, I haven't had a chance actually to read that piece yet, so
No.
I'm not sure. But let me tell you how, just the basics of the idea behind resentment and its roots in sort of social psychology. So, resentment is an emotion. Emotions have cognitive antecedents. You have some beliefs, and then the beliefs lead to emotion. Now, some people think you have something more deeply unconscious that creates an emotion, but my work generally concentrates on beliefs and cognitions. And some of these are, of course, created by political actors. Some of them come from just changes in our society.
So
Now,
people are you say so people perceive things that lead to the emotions, so they perceive things that
right.
lead to ideas that lead to the emotions in your model.
You have to emotions are defined by their cognitive antecedents or what they perceive. So
Mm-hmm.
resentment is the idea you have to have certain kinds of perceptions. One, I am a member of a group. Two, that group has a position on a hierarchy among groups, an ethnic hierarchy. And then if you believe that your group is now in an undeserved position, you are going to feel this emotion. So you'll get the cognition. I'm in a group. It's in an ethnic hierarchy. It is in a position it should not be in. And then the emotion kicks in. And once the emotion kicks in, this then has effects on how you process information, how you form beliefs, and actually what your preferences are.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are under the sway of this emotion resentment, you will desire your group to be in a higher status. This will become as important maybe as money or other kinds of values. You're likely to privilege certain kinds of information that relates to ethnic status rather than about the economy or something else. And you're going to form beliefs, maybe reinforcing your views about your group being in an unwanted status position.
Okay. Now,
So that's the basics of it.
I think that Zach introduced resentment by way of comparing two towns in, I think, the Baltic states, maybe the same Baltic state.
Lithuania, right. So what I did throughout that first book is there are puzzling variation. This is about violence. So you have both the emotion and then the state breaks down. And then one group
And this
can
is when,
attack.
in what period of history? This is in the
This
40s,
was
right?
this was in the 40s, but the book has cases throughout Eastern European history of the 20th century.
Okay, but in this case, correct me if I'm wrong, but what is it that Soviet rule had given way to Nazi rule?
Yes. So why this was a good laboratory to study it in is that you had different occupiers. So you had a period of independence after the First World War. Groups came to see themselves as dominant. And then you had occupiers who came in and effectively changed the ethnic hierarchy. And then I had 4 different stories about, given the comings and goings of the Germans or the Soviets, who would be the targets of the attack that would then explain these puzzling variations. So why would Lithuanians attack Jews at one time and Poles at another? Well, some stories based on ethnic prejudice would say, well, it's the content of the cognition about the group that would drive it. Well, the resentment says it's not the content of the group, it is about the position of the group. And these two make different hypotheses, and then you can sort of test these hypotheses. And there's also, I talked about fear and hatred. You attack a group because you see it as a threat, or just rage, which is you're having a bad time, and then you just attack any group as sort of a frustration, aggression. But I tell these 4 stories theoretically, and then I tell them over and over in cases in Eastern Europe, and to try to see which ones predict the targets correctly.
Okay. And I would say that in this Vox piece, particular emphasis was put on resentment. I mean, your work, I think, has emphasized various emotions: contempt, resentment, fear, and the way they interact. I think a lot of emphasis was put on resentment. And here's a quote from the piece. They, I think meaning the data or something. Anyway, they showed the extent of white Christian anger. Oh no, the Donald Trump phenomenon shows the extent of, as well as certain currents in Europe, show the extent of white Christian anger. The privileged who are furious that their privileges are being stripped away by those they view as outside interlopers. Now, some might find it a little odd to use the word privilege to refer to Trump supporters, because generally when you see their demographic characterized, you don't think of like privileged Americans, right? You hear about Appalachia and unemployed workers in Ohio and so on.
Well, the question, and again, I wish I had had time, but I'm in the middle of the start of a semester, but if you're going to apply this idea of resentment to the Trump supporters, you'd go through sort of a checklist. You would ask, do people see themselves as part of a group? And I think this is the most interesting thing about the Trump phenomena is whether white working class people are now coming in our country to see themselves as part of a group. And I think that to me is the number one, from my perspective, whether we get this first basic idea, which is of course is necessary to say that resentment is at work. So the second thing is, do people see themselves as part of group hierarchies? And I think this is pretty natural, actually, and I think they might very well do that. And then thirdly, are they in an undeserved position, and especially do they see a reversal happening? So if you see, white, it's not their economic part, it's not really their privilege, which is important to me. It's whether they see themselves as part of a group hierarchy. And I guess where the privilege comes in is whether they believe that their new position is in an undeserved, that because of their privilege they should be on top, right?
Right.
And then this gets reversed. This gets the emotion of resentment going, and this then shapes beliefs, information flowing, and becomes sort of a cycle that just reinforces some of the politics, and part of it is to vote for Trump, I guess.
And so you see, I mean, I know you don't specialize in domestic politics, but just from what you read in the papers, so to speak, it's your sense that this dynamic is one thing that's at work with Trump supporters?
Yes, I think it probably is. Just a second, I'm going to plug in my computer. I think we are seeing, especially, demographics are changing. And my punchline in Eastern Europe was that this resentment was almost inevitable, because Eastern Europe, it had rural people which were almost, I'll say Lithuania, for instance, only about 5% of the capital city of Lithuania was Lithuanian in 1900. It was 40% Jewish, 40% Polish, 15% Russian, Belarusian. But development was going to change that, where the countryside that was almost universally Lithuanian, they were going to come into the cities, see that they were not on the top of a hierarchy, and they were going to have some reaction against that. And during their period of independence, they did things non-violently, and then during this other very quick status reversals, this led to violence sometimes. But the demographic change led to almost a very predictable form of resentment. And in the United States, the percentage of white Christians is just going to change. And I think inevitably this demographic change is very likely to lead to higher perceptions of group hierarchy. And sometimes, and I think this is a matter of politics, how much it leads to sort of a feeling that this was an undeserved kind of event.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I think some people would see real contrast here. I mean, I gather that in Lithuania, in at least some of the towns, that a Jewish population had actually assumed a fairly high level in the social hierarchy in displacing previously powerful Christian groups. In America, in the case of both Mexicans and Muslims, I don't think most people would see it. I mean, I'd say there's two things. I don't think most people would say, well, yeah, now, Mexicans are really running the show in America politically, and they certainly wouldn't say that about right. Muslims. And then the other thing is that these are to the, well, I'll stop there. That's the first thing I'd say, right?
So let me say, so I think the big question here, and I don't study American politics so much, but for me, the question is this a matter of resentment, which is about the status of a group, or is it about prejudice and what people see as the content of groups? This is about the emotion of ethnic contempt. If you see a group as having a bad quality, then the emotion is contempt, and there's a whole other set of predicted features from that. If it's about resentment, it's not about how you see the inherent quality of the group, but just the position. So let me give you an example. My argument in Yugoslavia, for instance, is in Bosnia, Serbs didn't have any negative perception of Bosnian Muslims, except when Yugoslavia collapsed and there was a Bosnian state and the Bosnian Muslims were going to take a superior position in the hierarchy. That is why Serbs reacted against Muslims, not because they saw Muslims as anything inherently wrong with them. They probably didn't even think about Muslims before this change in the group position. So when you come to American politics, the question I would ask, how much of this is about change in group position, and how much of it is about the actual prejudice or the cognitions about the group qualities?
And I guess strictly speaking, what matters is the perception of changes in group status, right? Not really the reality. I mean, so for example,
right.
If things are going bad for, say, members of the white working class in some town, and even if it isn't, their jobs were not taken by Mexicans, but they're kind of in a bad mood because things aren't going well, and they see a Mexican doing a gardening job down the road, not one they ever aspired to, but it's happening. And then they have the frustration of having to press 2 for English speaking, and so on. I mean, I assume that kind of thing can give rise to a perception that your status has been compromised. And whether that's the case, and what matters is the perception.
Yeah, well, this is the two books you mentioned. The one was about this demographic change in Eastern Europe, and it really wasn't about how politicians change any of those perceptions or our perceptions. It was actually based on some reality. There were rural people that were not incorporated in the state. They had to learn how to read. They had to be conscripted into armies. They had experiences that went along with state formation that then brought them to these comparisons. The other book I wrote, though, is more about how politicians might actually shape these perceptions, and that the perceptions are not necessarily flowing from actual structural changes. So I think there's two possibilities here, that what we're seeing is this politics coming from just demographic change, and the other thing is, this is a matter of political type of the nature of Trump politics. Or it could be, I think what you're suggesting is things are going badly for me and I find sort of a scapegoat, and it happens to be a group. This is actually one of the 4 stories I tell in the Eastern European cases: resentment, hatred, fear, and rage. Rage is that I've had a bunch of stuff go badly for me and I'm just going to pick up a group to beat up on. This is, classic frustration aggression theory. So these things, I think you can tease out maybe by looking at the data. So I don't think the resentment story is clear, although I do think there is an inevitable tendency towards amount of resentment just because of the demographic changes that we're going to see in this country, and how the future is being sort of projected onto the present.
The other thing I'd say about Mexicans and Muslims in America is that I think this, to the extent that there's a sense of threat from either, they're largely different kinds of threats, right? I mean, Mexicans are seen as threats for jobs, whereas Muslims are seen by people who feel threatened as a terrorist threat. Of course, it's true that Donald Trump has depicted Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals. He's really emphasized that. He's played that up. But I still, my sense is that still these are different kinds of threats that may be perceived.
Yeah, I tend to see the whole Muslim thing as a lot different than the threat from, say, Mexican immigration. I mean, I'm born in rural Nebraska. I grew up in rural Iowa mostly. Whole towns in western Iowa have transformed in the meatpacking towns from white to Mexican. I mean, that is a real substantial change. Nobody can say this is just about prejudice when whole towns like Storm Lake and Denison and South Sioux City, Nebraska have completely changed their demographics, and people say that. Now, the Muslim thing, to me, this seems like a manipulated kind of fear, to tell you the truth. And I was actually on a board that advised Homeland Security on findings from social science into that area, and that seems to me like something that's been created. I have to say. So I think these are really different things. And just to say, well, how people react to Mexican Americans and Muslims and sort of lump them in as just common xenophobia, I'm not sure this is really a good thing to do.
Okay. At this point, I do want to characterize the argument that was made in the Vox piece, because in a way I'm getting a slightly different sense from you than I got from the piece. Now, I should say that the piece was criticized in The Week, a piece by Damon Linker, and here's what he says. Let me give you the critique before I quote some things from the piece itself. But Linker says, but the real problem with the way Beauchamp and so many others on the center left talk about those on the nationalist right is that it displays outright contempt. This is the view of Beauchamp. Outright contempt for particularist instincts that are not and should not be considered morally and politically beyond the pale. So he saw the Beauchamp piece as kind of a hit job on Trump supporters. And let me read you some parts of the Beauchamp piece that might have been, that he quoted, that Linker, I think, quoted. He says, first of all, he sets up this dichotomy between kind of economic explanations of Trumpism, dislocated by globalization, economic problems and so on, kind of versus other explanations. And here's what he writes. This research finds, this is Beauchamp, this research finds that contrary to what you'd expect, the losers of globalization aren't the ones voting for these parties. That includes the European far-right parties. What unites far-right politicians and their supporters on both sides of the Atlantic is a set of regressive attitudes toward difference. Racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobic, and not economic anxiety, are their calling cards. So the dichotomy he's setting up is either things have it's either economic causes or bigotry as the source of the thing, right? At least as I read that particular paragraph. I don't think that's quite the way you'd put it.
No, I don't probably see that. I think economics is probably overplayed. I think people, I think the problem with a lot of people that are on both the left and right is they're going to tell people what their interests are. They have a view of what people's interests should be. Because I worked so long in Kosovo and Bosnia, and I've been working in Iraq and this, I write on intervention. We intervene around the world, and we believe people should have the values and interests that we think they should have. I think we do the same thing in the United States. We say, well, they should have these values about economic progress. Thomas Frank, what's wrong with Kansas kind of stuff. And I think really how people see their interests is affected by their emotions they have sometimes. And that's one of the ideas in my theory is that emotions can actually affect preference change. And the world creates ways that they experience these emotions, and this creates their preferences. But it's not based simply on economics, and it's not just based on this frustration, aggression, finding targets. It's something more about how you feel about your group and its position and its future. Right. And I think this has to do with we're not involved with either of these types of things that are the common ways of viewing.
Now that could lead to bigotry, right? The kinds of emotions you're describing, right. and it
well,
can.
If I could talk about another emotion.
Yeah, can I just pause and put a slightly finer point on this, just to be clear? Because when I read this thing from Beauchamp, my reaction was, wait, that's like a false dichotomy. He says the conventional wisdom is that economic losses suffered by so on explains the rise of this new right. But then he says, well, okay, here he does put it more like you might put it. A vast universe of academic research suggests the real drivers are something very different: anger over immigration and a toxic mix of racial and religious intolerance. So it seems to me, I mean, he's putting kind of like religious and ethnic intolerance at the same level kind of explanation as economic grievance and like anger over immigration, whereas what I would see is what's at the same level is anger over immigration and economic grievance as kind of rival explanations of the toxic attitudes, of the intolerance and the bigotry, right?
Well, I think you could see because resentment, part of the idea is it's going to shape your information you collect and some of the things you do there, which could then lead, you can see a chain leading to something like contempt or bigotry. Right. It doesn't really have to be. In the book I wrote, the things, indicators of resentment were whose language you spoke, who was in the police. If you're a person, and it was about your day-to-day experience of who's on top and who's on the bottom. And this was not about economics. What drove Lithuanians crazy about Jews is because there was a division of labor in that society. Lithuanians were more farmers, Jews were the merchants, and people actually didn't get along that badly. What happened is when one group came and they had Jewish policemen for the first time, to be told what to do by a Jewish policeman, that was a big problem. That drove people crazy. We see the same thing here with our police and what's going on here. We have whites that are white policemen and black. Now, this isn't all about economics. This is about the day-to-day perception of being unfairly dominated. And, of course, in Eastern Europe, the biggest question was language. Whose language should the state be administered in? And if I see my group as all the day-to-day functioning of the state, how come it's not my group's language? How come I have to experience and going in the other group's language? And of course, this brings up some of the ideas that we see about Spanish, banning Spanish, whatever else. So these kinds of things about day-to-day dominance in police, language, street names, all of this have elements of dominance that are not directly connected to either economics or bigotry, as we talk about.
Okay, so you do think, before we move on to the other emotion you wanted to describe, you do think that if you look at all these things, actual fear of terrorism, maybe some fear of crime at the hands of immigrants, economic fears and so on, that the single thing you would emphasize most about Trump supporters is resentment?
Well, I think the fear is largely created, to tell you the truth. I don't think people actually go around looking for like the terrorist is going to kill them every day. I just can't imagine that. I think that there's bigotry there, but that's something that's more deeper in our society. It doesn't explain the changes that we see with Trump. And I think the frustration, aggression thing that, we've been in a recession, so we're looking for scapegoats, that doesn't really fly. I do think we are getting a stronger perception of group. I think we're getting stronger perception of group hierarchy. And now how people are going to interpret that, I think Trump has come in and he's helped people interpret that as an unfair thing. So yeah, I do tend to think that this emotion is very powerful in that.
So to some extent, maybe it is a result of just growing diversification and almost the difficulty of handling diversification in a way that no group finds threatening.
Yeah, well, the prediction about resentment is if you have society that's so mixed up, say you had 50 groups in it, you're not going to be able to cognitively sort yourself into groups and group hierarchies. And the prediction is you will not have that resentment. Now, there's a couple ways the United States could go. We could see ourselves as in this pluralistic way of multiple groups and not be focused on our group and group hierarchy. The other way America could go is we see ourselves in 4 or 5 different kind of tribes, and these tribes struggling for position, and that's an America that's going to have a lot of problems. But it has to do with how these cognitions of group and tribe are formed. And it's not inevitable that it's going to go one way or the other, but I think the tendencies, given the changes in demography, are actually towards these sort of 5 groups seeing each other. And the politics of Trump and what we're seeing is, especially with the emergence of something that now is like, we talk about the white working class as a tribe. And if we have that tribe, and that's not going to see itself well on changes in ethnic hierarchy, I'm afraid.
Right.
This is going to be a more permanent, lasting part of our politics.
Now, some people have characterized it as white identity politics, and some have further said that it is to some extent a reaction to the identity politics on the left. In other words, seeing blacks as a very distinct group with distinct grievances, and gay people and so on.
Well, if black lives matter, how come white lives don't matter? I mean, it's a natural reaction.
And so you do think that white identity politics is to some extent a reaction against black, or the identity politics on the left, which can be Latino, black.
Just even divorce it. If Group A says A lives matter, I think Group B is, I think it's a natural way of just saying B lives matter. Let's even get it out of I think there's something fundamental to human psychology here outside of history of race relations, which only probably serves to make it more problematic.
Mm-hmm. Although that is more powerful to the extent that the group sees itself as a group in the first place. And,
yeah, right.
And one thing you're seeing is more and more white working class people see themselves as a group.
Right. 20 years ago, you might not have had a reaction to, Black Lives Matter because you maybe didn't have such an idea about white identity, and no doubt Trump is doing something there. And but I think we're going to see that to some extent anyway.
Okay, so what's the other emotion you wanted to discuss?
Well, this gets at what you brought up about contempt, but I think the one interesting thing about group identity is among whites, where we're getting white working class, but there's a perception that there's sort of a liberal elite against the white working class, right? And this is, are we going to get 2 groups on this hierarchy of white working class against the sort of liberal elite? And of course, there's a whole long-standing kind of idea about limousine liberals, right? But now, if limousine liberals become seen as this larger group, and I think some of the politics we're seeing more on the left is this politics about indignation. Now, indignation is an emotion where you have 3 different groups. You have A, which is seen as a perpetrator against B, and C as the observer. And the observer, to feel indignation, will observe that A is committing some bad action against group B, and the action is to condemn group A. Now, if you really like to feel indignation, if your group is sort of based on this emotion, which has certain effects of unifying the group, you need to construct A and B in a certain way to heighten your sense of indignation. So you're going to construct A as a very bad actor and B as blameless. Now, where I see this in my own work, it's not American politics, is in international interventions. I think there's a whole NGO world and the R2P world, and they want to...
R2P being right to protect.
Right to protect.
A kind of somewhat new emphasis that's entered international law.
Right. And so there's a whole group of liberal interventionists. And I teach a class at MIT with Barry Posen on great power military interventions. But I think there's a group which, is pushing for intervention. And though to do this, they need to construct the perpetrator and the victim as perpetrator-victim groups. And to construct the perpetrator as really sort of evil and the victim is relatively blameless. Now, in my areas of like Kosovo, Serbs and Albanians, there's just a problem fighting over a state. I don't tend to see them as the great evil versus the more victim. But this is the way when to intervene, you have to help this. But
just out of curiosity, how do you view Syria? Because that's the current intervention debate.
Well, look at who's in Syria, right? You have Nusra, you've got Assad, you've got ISIS, you've got our Free Syrian Army, which can't keep itself together at all. You've got the Kurds. I mean, you can say Assad started this and all this kind of thing, but what you have now are just a variety of groups fighting over the control of that state. And, my view is I'm not so moralistic about this. And it's going to have to be a reckoning, and it's probably going to look like Lebanon, where it's going to be divided up by sectarian groups. But this is a way to view the world. I'm a person who sort of views conflict as more natural, and it's not moral problems behind conflict. Human beings are naturally in conflict.
But indignation is invoked by people who want to mobilize groups to do things, including intervention, in the case of... Now, I mean, all these emotions are things that are invoked by politicians who want to get groups to do things, right? That's a lot of what this is about.
And you want to keep your group together. But I think that there's some on the left that are have a sort of an indignation dynamic. And what I see played out was with the recent Hillary Clinton comments, right? Clinton was talking to fundraisers. She is the outside observer. She's talking to groups which are the downtrodden groups or the victims, and then she constructs a perpetrator group that's either half of them are stupid or half of them are irredeemable deplorables. And what's interesting to me is that there's not a bigger reaction against that comment. It hasn't really moved the polls anyplace. And I think part of it is
I think there was a little tightening of the polls after there were two things. There was the pneumonia and there was that at about the same time. And in the aftermath, things got a little closer in the polls, I think. It's hard to disentangle.
Yeah. But I think here's the danger. And again, I'm not an American. I don't study this as much. But if you have this type of politics going on where it's helpful politically to construct one group as irredeemable deplorables, well, that group is going to see those who construct them as irredeemable limousine liberal elites, right? Mm-hmm. And we're going to get a politics in this country of mutual contempt. Then it's not just about straightening out the group position, which I think you could do politically. Then you get groups saying there's something inherently bad about the limousine liberals, and there's something inherently bad about the Trump supporters. And then we've got, once you get into this politics of contempt, then we have a real big problem.
Well, and I think some would say it's been there for a while. I mean, before Hillary said this, there were people who said that, that some Trump supporters believe that they are viewed with contempt by East Coast elites. And I would say that some conservatives have encouraged this. You probably remember Dan Quayle talking about the, quote, cultural elites who have, and I think he used the word contempt. I think maybe it's him. Somebody about that time, a conservative, prominent conservative, said they have contempt for the values of ordinary Americans. So this has been used as a group mobilizer on the right.
And it's a mobilizer, but it has not led to such strict identification of groups. We are in the deplorables. They are in the other groups, right? And now you're seeing, are we going to get into groups is this going to become a defining feature of groups rather than just a mobilizing political strategy? And if this happens in our country, then we're going to have more longstanding problems.
Yeah. Now, it's easy. One thing you're saying is one thing I believe, which is that you can look at various kinds of conflicts and various kinds of polarization, ideological polarization in American, sectarian conflict in the sense of Sunni Shia or Catholic Protestant in Ireland, national conflict. But to some extent, in all of these cases, it tends to be the same kind of psychology at work. The same kinds of emotions arise, right?
Right. I think that social psychology, if you look at social identity theory, you look at the findings of this, I think on hierarchy too, people do tend to think in groups and group hierarchies. Now, whether there are ways to erode that or deal with it, that's what we study as political scientists. But we've always seen America as an exception to these processes that we've seen in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And whether if we get group identities and group hierarchies seen in the same way, I think we're going to see politics that aren't that much different, and I'm not sure we're going to see American exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, I used to say that America is a relatively successful experiment in diversity compared to other societies, but I'm becoming less confident in that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an open question, and I don't think it's inevitable, but from what I've seen from my own research, some of the same forces seem to be coalescing here in 2016 presidential election, and I don't think it's making me less optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Have you looked much into the business of kind of perspective taking? In other words, people, say a Trump supporter, kind of just not empathizing with a Hillary supporter emotionally, but kind of understanding what the world looks like to a Hillary supporter and vice versa. I mean, I think you would probably say Hillary's basket of deplorables remark was it suggested a failure on her part to accurately see the way the world looks to the average Trump supporter. Anyway, maybe I'm wrong, but I get that sense from you. But have you looked at this as well, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Do you think Hillary Clinton really cared, and was it such a mistake? Maybe she's signaling to her own supporters that, hey, we're in this group together, and we have to mobilize as a group against the deplorables. I'm not sure. I can't really read Hillary Clinton's mind on this.
No, I think certainly she wants to mobilize the black vote and the Latino vote, and that could be abetted by making them feel under threat, just as, and not that they aren't, I'm not saying they wouldn't be, I mean, especially Latinos maybe in the case of Trump, but I'm not saying they wouldn't be, but leave that aside, it's in her political interest to make the constituents she wants to mobilize feel threatened by her rival.
Right.
But I think the concern you heard on the left after that remark was that she had overplayed it, and to an extent that would mobilize the so-called deplorables, right?
Right. Well, when Hillary Clinton was, just to go back to my other point, why I came up with sort of thinking this way is when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and she led the Libya intervention, and she really built up the anti-Gaddafi forces, blameless victim group, and they weren't a bunch of good guys, right? So she has a tendency of using this strategy when she's Secretary of State, and comes out in her own domestic political kinds of ways.
Well, indignation is a thing for her, I think.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question, because I read in your biography you're from Oklahoma originally.
Well, I was born in Oklahoma. That had more to do with my father being in the Army, but my parents were both from West Texas, so I also lived in Midland, El Paso, went to high school in San Antonio. We moved around because my father was in the Army.
Well, so I was just in Nebraska and Iowa last month, and now I come back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the capital of liberal academic elite. And, I listen to people there and I listen to people here, and, they construct images of each other. And, which is the least accurate, and which is the one that's going to prevent any kind of dialogue. I have to say that Cambridge, Massachusetts doesn't score real high on some of this as far as listening and accurate construction of who the other side is.
What are the biggest misconceptions? Is it the kind of Hillary idea that they're all just bigots and that's the end of the story, or what?
Well, if you take came out in this book that I just reviewed on Wisconsin rural politics. The idea is that people in these rural, especially homogenously white areas, are really just thinking about race or Obama being a black president and how much this angers them, and that you just really don't get that. You really get a sense more out there that government and people aren't even talking that much like they do here about Trump and Clinton, because that's some world that's clear out there that's abandoned us. You hear more about local property taxes and things like that sometimes. And, they're sort of like people vote for Trump because, we just given up on the normal politics. So why not pull the lever for this guy? Mm-hmm. And it's not really these specific types of bigotry that you hear. And, I think there is a unfortunate sort of way that we're constructing each other in this country, which is going to lead to some of this. So,
yeah, it has long been my perception that a very large majority of white Americans I've met in various parts of the country, my sense has been that they genuinely do not want to think of themselves as racists. That they would like to be able to say they have a black friend, that they like to have a pleasant encounter with a black person. I think. That's look. I believe me. I've seen actual racism. It's there, but and what I'm saying may be changing now. I mean, things change in countries, but I have always had the feeling that most people in general I know most people want to think of themselves as being good people, and I think in many cases that entails actually trying to be a good person.
Right. But I think that. Well, if we get to the politics with Trump, it's easy to start demonizing people, and those who are demonized are going to react, and there's going to be a cycle here.
Well, I think that's part of the psychology he is fomenting himself. It works for him for them to feel that they are held in contempt.
Right.
And that was what bothered me about one thing that bothered me about the deplorables remark. Well, is there anything else you want to say that we haven't covered about the range of emotions or?
No, that's. I wrote these books. People can read, especially the one that came out in 2011, that dealt also with anger and contempt as well as resentment. I try to, go from social psychology to build hypotheses to testing this on actual data. Now, big question we've been talking about is how much this kind of work applied in other areas actually applies to the United States, and whether we're going to see the same types of politics across other countries and are they coming to our country? And this is a pretty fascinating question to ask, I think.
Mm-hmm. So that book is Western Intervention in the Balkans, and maybe the subtitle is of special relevance here, The Strategic Use of Emotion in Conflict, which involves the way emotions can be manipulated by leaders, among other things.
That's correct. How they can create these cognitions about groups and group qualities and things like that. So, I think we could talk a couple days on this, but
yeah, but well. Let me ask you one question in closing. A number of people I know have said over the last few months, this is the scariest time they remember, and in the world, and by that they mean not just polarization and contention in America and the demise of civil discourse or whatever, but things going on in the world, countries in the Middle East falling apart, and we're part of it, and maybe we've helped cause it, and so on, and relations with both Russia and China not that great. There's a lot of things going on, and I think one thing we've suggested here is that to some extent, some of these problems boil down to the same problem, at least at the human psychological level. Right. And there are people who think that it's no coincidence that this is going on because some of it's technologically driven. It's easier to seal yourself off in an echo chamber where you only hear from people who agree with you and so on. A lot of explanations, but I'm wondering how you assess the peril of this time compared to other times.
Well, I tend to think it's exaggerated. I'm 57. I remember when I was a kid growing up 100 miles from Omaha, as in like an 80-year-old, you'd discuss that Omaha would be hit with nuclear missiles by the Soviets, and whether we die from radiation or from the original blasts. That's the kind of thing that, in the height of the Cold War, the world was not the best place. And I think we if you look at violence and civil war, if you look at the data on this, we're not really going to hell in a handbasket. And the world is not improving like the Steven Pinker idea about better angels of ourselves, and we're all becoming more peaceful. But I tend to see much more continuity in these things, and conflicts are inevitable. And I think even I teach a class called Riots, Rebellions, Revolutions. I look at the data on riots in this country in the late 60s. I mean, it dwarfs anything going on so far in Charlotte, both in violence and in intensity. So I think if we look at our own country and compare, even these problems we have right now with those of the late 60s, it looks not that bad to me.
Okay. Well, it's good to close on a reassuring note. I tend to be a little more apocalyptic and look at things.
Well, I can tell you an apocalyptic story too. But as I said, I think this country is going to come to have to deal with some of these questions. But the balance of power in the world and some other things. We've seen tough times in the world before. We made it through.
Okay. Well, that's a happy way to to end the conversation. Again, thank you, Roger Peterson, political scientist at MIT. A couple of books, Western Intervention in the Balkans and Understanding Ethnic Conflict. And I hope you're right. Thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thanks.